We gathered at the 2017 National Constitutional Convention, coming from all points of the southern sky, make this statement from the heart. Our Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander tribes were the first sovereign nations of the Australian continent and its adjacent islands, and possessed it under our own laws and customs. This our ancestors did, according to the reckoning of our culture, from the creation, according to common law, from time immemorial, and according to science more than 60,000 years ago. This sovereignty is a spiritual notion, the ancestral tie between the land or Mother Nature and the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who were born therefrom, remain attached thereto, and must one day return thither to be united with our ancestors. This link is the basis of the ownership of the soil, or better, of sovereignty. It has never been ceded or extinguished, and coexists with the sovereignty of the Crown. How could it be otherwise that a people's possessed a land for 60 millennia and this sacred link disappears from world history in merely the last 200 years? With substantive constitutional change and structural reform, we believe this ancient sovereignty can shine through a fuller expression of Australia's nationhood. Proportionally, we are the most incarcerated people on the planet. We are not an innately criminal people. Our children are aliened from their families at unprecedented rates. It cannot be because we have no love for them. And our youth languish in detention in obscene numbers. They should be our hope for the future. These dimensions of our crisis tell plainly the structural nature of our problem. This is the torment of our powerlessness. We seek constitutional reforms to empower our people and take a rightful place in our own country. When we have power over our destiny, our children will flourish. They will walk into worlds and their culture will be a gift to their country. We call for the establishment of a First Nations voice enshrined in the Constitution. Makarrata is the culmination of our agenda, the coming together after a struggle. It captures our aspirations for a fair and truthful relationship with the people of Australia and a better future for our children based on justice and self-determination. We seek a Makarrata Commission to supervise a process of agreements between governments and First Nations and truth-telling about our history. In 1967, we were counted. In 2017, we seek to be heard. As we leave base camp and start our trek across this vast country, we invite you to walk with us in a movement of the Australian people for a better future. That's the Uluru Statement. But I first want to say thanks to each and every one of you for showing up. This is how we power people's movements. It doesn't matter how big or small these spaces are. This is absolutely crucial to where we're at right now as a nation. And what you do and what you take away from this is so essential to the future of our country. So seriously, I can only imagine how busy your jobs are with your family commitments. And, as a Blackfulla, we don't get time off. There's no 9 to 5 for us or 7 to 7. And we need each and every Australian standing in solidarity in this moment and making sure that we really push for this in the next 18 months.
This idea that we also do have a duty to our own people to campaign and to challenge, and that's unfair at the same time. That there's a burden for any minority group anywhere in the world that can be quite hard to swallow sometimes, that, you know, of course it's right and proper that that everyone should be treated equally, but we're not. And therefore we have to make this journey, and we have to justify ourselves, we have to vindicate ourselves, we have to campaign. So I'm wondering about that, both as a person, but also in your experience dealing with so many other groups across Australia. I mean, can you feel that burden, and that comes back that this is hard, having to campaign for what should be?
Yeah, Australia's an incredibly difficult colony. When especially you've got over 250 First Nations, it doesn't make us analogous to somewhere like, Aotearoa or New Zealand. So trying to understand my obligation in doing the work, it's incredibly difficult, even from a First Nations perspective, where you've got many different voices within the First Nations community. So we have, in addition to what I witnessed with your campaign in terms of marriage equality, we have additional layers of challenges. The double majority, keeping our mob in the tent in terms of really making sure that this is spearheaded by First Nations people, and that we're bringing the rest of Australia along on this journey.
Yeah, funny. I think about the unfairness of the process sometimes, the unfairness of the referendum, and the high barriers, and what it. And I can remember, like, we spent so long when we were talking about marriage here, discussing the process of getting there instead of the quality of the content, why it mattered. The temptation can be to look inwards on the process, and especially within a community, we can end up looking at the process. We ended up analysing it. This is terrible. It shouldn't be a public vote. And you're going, well, yeah, but it's not going to be our call in the end. And that was a really hard discussion, because it was a burden to have. And I know we were going to come back to it, but I thought I was interested when you said the platform. Because now I think it's one of the really fascinating things about a campaign as you head towards a referendum or any campaign, about this idea that you're an umbrella, or a platform that has to voluntarily bring people with you. That it's not a case of you get to boss anyone around in this campaign. You don't get to say, I'm the official voice, and then you tell all of those different groups that you're talking about that this is what you have to say today. Because that's not going to work. I presume the response would be exactly what I would have thought it would be if we had said it the other way around. But I think tell us about, that challenge of trying to build a platform.
Yeah, well, I think, when people say, why do we have to do it? Why do we have to, get the people to vote? And for us, it's it's a necessary evil, in the sense that we're trying to rectify a foundational wrong in this nation. And the issue in Australia is because there was no moral recognition at first contact. We're a nation without treaties. We're a nation that basically, if we're being very honest with ourselves, was built on the assumption that they would successfully wipe First Nations people out. And that is, has been made lawful throughout the history of this colony. So the huge challenge for us now is that 250 plus years later, we're trying to retrofit a reform that should have been done at first contact, or at least at federation, at the bare minimum. And so, what we have to do, it's a people's movement. In order to, for better or worse, change this system, is we have to make sure that we galvanise the Australian people to give it the mandate, really, because we know, as Indigenous people, we can't trust public institutions. We've never been able to rely on these political cycles that promise to close the gap. Going into one election, they go to the second election and nothing changes, or resources get promised. It's short-term thinking.
But there's a hard part to this too, though, as well, isn't there? Because, and I think people miss this, because they think when we talk about campaigns, you think about political campaigns, and you think about the boss of a party who gets up on Monday and goes, right, everybody, you're saying this. And then everybody the whole way down the party goes this for that week, and then the message changes. Big social change campaigns like this, they're voluntary structures. I was thinking when we were doing this with marriage, we had no right to be the campaign. The only right we had to be the campaign was what right voluntarily organisations from Perth right over to here bestowed on us, which they could withdraw at any moment.
Yeah.
And then, that great phrase, the other part of, if you're a leader who's, so far ahead of your people, you're just someone taking a walk. And that's where we always risk being. So you're always balancing, you want to get progress, but now at the moment you also have to build something that's totally voluntary among people who know each other.
We have to get people to buy into this, right? And one of the challenges we've had in the campaign is that there's been such a decade of distrust in public institutions generally, that, again, an additional layer on one, trying to get everyday Australians to understand the reform, and two, to get people to buy into the kind of concept of this is important for us as Australians to get this work done and not hand this baton over to the next generation. Like, it is our obligation absolutely now to do this work. And so getting people to, it's an interest, like, some people speak about the differences between the marriage equality and where we're at. Like, I know, I've spoken to Sally Rugg about this before, and marriage equality campaigners often talk about the 5 different campaigners. You can kind of persuade either way. There's one you're never going to really persuade. There's, the one that's always on board in the middle, and then the 2 on the side that you've got to tinker over to your yes campaign. And it's been even a bigger hurdle for us because actually not many Australians have a personal relationship with a First Nations person. And so getting Australians to buy in, we actually have to get every Australian to ask themselves, what does this mean to you as someone who lives on this unceded land? What does it mean to get this unfinished business sorted for our generation now? And unpacking your own story, I think, is such a powerful tool in being able to go out and advocate. Some people say, well, what do I do? And actually, when I was jumping on planes or buses or trains, there's no rule book to literally campaigning for a referendum. We had to create this conversation ourselves. And so that's what we're asking people to do, is check in with yourself, check in with your family. What does this mean? And to stand on the right side of history, because it is your story. It should mean as much to you as it means to me as a First Nations person. And that's, to try and reset this relationship as well among First Nations people and the rest of Australia.
I think that's really, I'm not just saying it to be nice, it's such a smart analysis, because it's really important, because sometimes we think marriage or the upcoming vote are actually votes about LGBT people or Indigenous people. There are votes about Australian. There are votes about everybody. They're about who we are. And referendums are really weird moments that actually, this once in a generation moment where you walk into the ballot box and you're actually voting about who you think you are and who you think you should be tomorrow. And tapping into that early as a campaign, I just think is really smart. It's tricky because you have to make people see the connection, so that they're thinking about it that way themselves. But that involves creating a campaign where people want to have conversations, which is interesting in itself. So that, how are we thinking about that at the minute? Because we're not going to be in control of those conversations. They're going to happen everywhere. In what can sound like, in social media land, an angry world sometimes.
Well, it's so interesting because we've not really been confronted with such a significant question like this. What it means to people is really a matter for them to place value on it. And trying to basically, I guess, win this thing absolutely means living and breathing it. Like, even now, as someone who's on the government's referendum engagement group, I know unless we continue to get the polls up and to power this thing, there still is the risk. There absolutely is the risk that they will pull the pin. If you're used to Indigenous affairs in this country, you know that the Uluru Statement is not the first request for systemic change. We've had the Barunga Statement, the Larrakia Petition, the Yirrkala Bark petitions, the Kirribilli Statement, many calls for change. And at each point, we've had Prime Minister's promise, treaty, or promised many different things. And we've had to learn some hard lessons as First Nations people in this campaign to go, we absolutely have to be hard-headed about where we're going as a nation. And I think one of the things that I keep coming back to is when I was in the dialogue process, which was totally unprecedented. You know, we had a cross-section of the Indigenous community involved in this. Not everyone, but it was a cross-section of, 20% elders, 40% traditional owners, 40% Indigenous leaders, and 20% elders. So there was a cross-section of the Indigenous community across the country off the back of 13 dialogues, unprecedented, talking about civics, and I saw the hard work. Like our elders were giving up their weekends for free to talk about how do we right the wrongs. And, it really makes me emotional because even as someone growing up in a land rights activist family around the campfire, very used to activism, it hurts when leadership of this country go, oh, no, we're just not going to do that now, even though, the blackfellas had put the effort in to get this done and invite the people to walk with us. And we're at such a critical point when you think about our community. We're 2 and a bit generations into invasion. We're on the cusp of losing such rich knowledge in this country. We die 20 years younger than, 15, 20 years younger than the rest of the nation. We absolutely need to see this change in their lifetime. And so Australia has to as well, like one of the parts of it is trying to not see us as a deficit, but seeing what the gift can be to the nation, what it means for the next generation, what it can mean for your children to go to school and learn language and sit down with an elder and build that relationship at the community level. That's a powerful thing to make sure that we're thinking of that vision for our nation, not one where we always see First Nations people as the problem.
Yeah. No, I think it's a great framing because referendums are about selling tomorrow.
Yeah.
They're about what is it tomorrow should look like, and for the first time ever you get to choose that, or the first time marriage was marriage was a makey-uppy one. We had the postal non-binding postal plebiscite, but then it was the monarchy before that and the republic vote. So it's a long time since people have an institutional memory of this. So a referendum itself is an unusual thing. I don't want to even ask are you worried about that because it is a big barrier. It's a big process, as opposed to a judicial process or a legal process. What do you think of the ups and downs of that one? Obviously, the power, hopefully, of a referendum, yes, is that it's very hard to overturn the will of the people.
Yeah, well, we don't have a great record. It's only 8 of 44 have passed. So, that's one thing. But we know that Australians have the biggest hearts. The most successful referendum in our nation's history was 1967. So we know if we strike while the iron's hot and get this thing right, that the goodwill of the people absolutely will walk with us. It's not the law that's difficult, it's been the politicians and politics of it at the moment that's been so, excruciating to change. Some people say, well, what if this thing fails? What does it mean for... Well, I think it's a great question. Why does Australia ask itself? Would be such a morally bankrupt country, I think, if this question was to fail. From a First Nations point of view, I think the bigger risk for us is the status quo is killing us. We cannot continue down the path we're at. So I'm running at this thing like we are absolutely got it in the bag. And Ireland's a good example of, I think as well, Australians don't like change. We're not that big of risk takers, but, you can speak to the example in Ireland where it's just go, go, go until it gets across the line.
We're referendum addicts. We just can't have... Literally, I think we're on at least one a year, but it means we have an infrastructure, which I think is interesting. You have to build up a legal infrastructure around it, a referendum commission, high court judges who mind the content, which of course has to be a worry. Without this structure, the campaign has to carry almost the responsibility of the structure that protects people from misinformation, because there'll be misinformation in a referendum. And there's no doubt about that. And unfortunately, without the structure which we have now, because every year we have to have one. We have a referendum about this year. We'll just pick something like a tombola, which actually, now that I think about it, sorry, I'm going to wander. Marriage happened in Australia, but it happened before Australia and New Zealand, which apparently was a real point of contention for some Australians who were very annoyed that New Zealand got it first. And everyone's saying, New Zealand's very sophisticated and they're way ahead of us. But New Zealand actually got marriage out of a raffle. It was in Parliament they have a raffle about what piece of legislation the backbencher can put up, and it came out of a hat. So the only reason New Zealand beat you, so you can, so there's no race of sophistication here. So in a way, you never get to decide what cards you get. You just decide how to play them, which I think for referendums is interesting. But without the structure to protect people from misinformation, I think that's one of the real burdens, I think, probably up for a campaign. How do you take care of people during this campaign? Because people will experience this. This isn't an abstract discussion about somebody else. It's a discussion about real people's status and standing in society, and how do we, in a way, almost that second duty of a campaign. Your first duty is to win, but your second duty is to mind people, because everybody's going to be around the following day, and how do we protect them in that?
Yeah, there's a couple of things I think in response to that. First is we're so far behind in our infrastructure and legislation when it comes to referendum processes. The government, one of their last bills they're going to table before Parliament closes this year is around how to run a referendum and the rules, because they're so outdated. It's been, I think, 40 years since our last successful referendum. So even that in and of itself is an enormous task to first get across the line. The second thing is taking care of people. And for me, the concern is clearly our old people, and especially our young people who are extraordinarily vulnerable in this. And campaigners have been talking about ways in which we can protect people engaging in these conversations. Unfortunately, you all would, racism is rampant in this country. As an ally, you absolutely have a role in just stamping that out. And I think that in conversations, the change starts to happen when you call out your friends, you call out your family. It's those moments you pull them up and stop them in their tracks so that doesn't go on to the next person. We really need people to be good advocates and allies in that. As well, we're thinking about ways in which we can build in mental health support for specifically First Nations peoples. That's an ongoing conversation right now.
Yeah, I know already. I've gone way over because I knew we would, because I wanted to ask other people to ask questions as well. Sorry, I knew we would. If you had one particular ask for individuals as we think about this, because whether it's a year or 18 months, what is it each person here can do?
Yeah, I just think don't wait to be asked to do something. This has been something that we have had to create space for ourselves. And right now we need you to be creative, whatever suits you in your life, to start these conversations or to tap into the campaign. There's formal websites out now, From the Heart or uluru.org. But the most powerful things are having conversations with your kids and, talking to your barista in those everyday yarns that you're having, or having chats in your running groups about, oh, did you see that? What do you think of, the voice? Do you want to wear some T-shirts on the weekend when you're doing, you're volunteering somewhere? People often think, especially when it's an enormous democratic task like this, that their act has to be all-consuming and overwhelming and grand and whatever. But in fact, what we've witnessed in this campaign is the tiny acts that culminate the massive ripple effects. It's the simple conversations that you're willing to, sit in the discomfort of it, and be willing to kind of embrace that discomfort to move through the conversation that we really need to get to, which is, being respectful of each other and making sure that we're sharing accurate information when we do engage in these conversations. We're very aware there's going to be misinformation out, especially on social media. It's something we're very conscious about. There's been parts of the media we haven't really even been able to try and control. But the power is absolutely in the people, and making sure that you're armed with accurate information. We have data that says when we know Australians have basic, accurate information, they feel more equipped to go out and be just the simple advocates in their everyday life, or lean on someone that they might see as a role model in the conversation and tap in and engage that way. What you do does not have to be all-consuming. It's simple acts of kindness and conversation with the discomfort of it. Because this is going to be really emotive time for us. We're going to a referendum in 18 months. We need to not take the pedal off the metal now, because the only way to get it across the line as well is making sure that government can see that we're continuing to push the conversation. Nothing has ever changed in First Nations affairs because we waited for government. It's because we've gone out and done the work, and we're asking you to walk with us now.
That's great. And I also think, I always say quite a bit of work as well. People underestimate their own influence all the time. The power of a single conversation, and how influential that is, especially among the circles of people that you're in, like your family, your colleagues, people who know you. And it always strikes me how much people think, oh, I couldn't possibly have an impact. I knew a fella, before I'm going to ask questions, I knew a fella called Dave Roach. Dave Roach was a fearless campaigner from Cork. And he was campaigning for LGBT rights now in the 70s, when you wouldn't have been campaigning for LGBT rights in Ireland. And he would, famously marching outside Cork City Hall with his gigantic poster saying the homosexuals are revolting. And he was getting beeps of support, but that's because they misunderstood what he meant. They thought, but I remember we went down to this fearless campaigner about a year and a half out from a referendum in Ireland, and said, here's what we need you to do. We need you to go and talk to your family and your street. And he was horrified. He goes, oh no, I can't do that. This fella who would quite happily march up and down in front of people who would throw things at him, but the barrier, the fear, and how much he undervalued himself in his power of that conversation. So I think it's a brilliant ask of people. You're going to talk to a lot of people about a lot of things over the next 18 months, and don't miss your chance to throw this in as well. Because
and it's back to this story you're telling yourself. The story you tell yourself is the story we create for our nation. Some of you, I don't know, some people, they're like, oh, they just think First Nation, it's just the right thing to do. Other people are persuaded by the fact that they want to see, less incarceration or mob having say in laws. Some people are like, well, this is not going to affect me at all, so why wouldn't I vote yes? Different people have different reasons why they're going to step into this conversation. You need to start to tap into your own story and what it means to you. I think it's really, in a way, turning a mirror back on themselves and, putting the question back to them. Why are you so against it? You tell me, your reasons. then I think interrogating their reasons, you can walk away from those conversations. You might not get the answer straight away, but I can absolutely assure you that conversation will sit with them in relation to moving forward to this. And it's so interesting you say that about children. I've had this similar conversation at a different group this week, where it was a gentleman kind of, the same generation, and he wanted to know what could we do for kids, and I was like, they're actually some of our most powerful campaigners. There's children's stories out now and whatever, but I emphasise the fact that this is our obligation as adults, like, to just unfortunately engage in this challenging piece of conversation. It probably is not going to even affect your friends in some ways in relation to, and I think when you turn a mirror on them and put the question back to them, it reveals, unfortunately, layers of racism. But I do think that they probably never had that put to them before in some ways. So it is starting. Don't think that it's not changing them just because they're not changing in that conversation.
It's great. Actually, on your intergenerational one, which is really interesting, one of the great campaigns we ran at home was called Ring Your Granny, which you can watch on YouTube. But it understood this point again: your influence within your own circle. So, young person in the family has an influence within that circle, and how do you build a campaign that lets them talk to the target voter that we really need them to talk to the most? So, and actually there's some beautiful videos on it, actually, if you look it up. But I think that intergenerational conversation could be a really interesting part of the campaign if we get that right within families and even within workplaces as well.
I can see how it polarizes some conversations. It's always interesting how the people, or First Nations people that already have platforms and voices, are the first to dissent from trying to nation build a new mechanism, because they've always been the voice. What we're trying to build is a voice that speaks to the grassroots communities and the issues that affect them on the ground. The other thing is, this is clearly an open conversation. There are other ways in which you can empower yourself through, there are different presentations I give going through, like objections, like how to respond to objections, or how to kind of set out your own story, or once you start in your mind to think about the different basic history of Australia, actually, around how these petitions have come about, how people can arm themselves with that knowledge, they're much better informed to go out and be active campaigners. It's going to be, a number of conversations that'll get people there. This in 1 hour is probably not going to get everyone across the ladder, but it's going to start to open up and tap into kind of planting that seed around growing this conversation in your own minds, and not, on the one hand, we can't spoon feed it to you, but it absolutely is a responsibility to go out and find the information as well. I do think that the current websites have really great starting points for just basic information. It's interesting though, the other thing I'm going to end with is, it's just so interesting how every time it becomes a First Nations thing, everyone wants to know every single detail. It's like, what's the model? What's the voice? What's it going to look like? It's like the standard when it comes to First Nations reform is honestly beyond any other kind of reform in the country. We've got, politicians who are handing out grants, millions of dollars left, right and centre, and no one questions it. What I want people to do is to not get caught up in having to think that you need to know every single detail about this. And I was saying to Tiernan before, one of the things we're at in Australia is actually trying to educate people about what a referendum process is as well. We're not going to wake up the day after a referendum and this voice is going to be, in a tower in Sydney or Canberra. It's about how we articulate to our community and to Australia what the process is prior to a referendum, how we get there, that the vote itself is just a rubber stamp to building and allowing the legislation to adapt and change to First Nations communities. First Nations communities across the country exist in their own governance in many different ways. You heard brother here say, you know, his is very matriarchal. My lineage is the same, in the sense that we know how our systems and communities are governed. If you go to Yolngu country, it's very different in terms of what their voice will look like. What we need Australians to understand is that a one-size model is not going to fit all. The demand for detail, and I'm not saying that this relates to your question, but it goes to kind of something that I've found interesting in this campaign is that we've had to put out every single dotted I and cross the T, and it's never really demanded of any other community in this country. But the process before and after and what a voice looks like across the country, we have to actually imagine that it's going to look different for different communities. That's the reality. If you walk into a First Nations community here or a First Nations community in Wiradjuri country or in Uluru in Perth, they're all set up differently. They're all governed differently by their own systems. It means that the whole point of a federal voice is to allow what already exists to tap up and into these processes. And that's something I think Australia is yet to really find the gift in. The gift that there is this ancient knowledge existing across the country in different ways. An example is as well, in New South Wales, we're very used to going to the ballot box in terms of our lands councils and membership based. Other lands councils or other parts of the country are very different. They might be quite patriarchal towards the top end of the country, or there might be a particular family line that dictates the decision making in that community. We actually have to accept that every First Nations community is very different. It's the same as politics. You know, people go, oh, but not all First Nations people agree in the voice. Well, not everyone in the Liberal Party agrees with everyone either. But the consensus in the Uluru Statement is absolutely significant, and that any dissenting voice has to have a very strong reason, and I actually haven't seen one yet, in relation to why they're dissenting. In fact, the hypocrisy in some of our own people's arguments is blatant in the sense, you know, we've got senators saying it's going to cede our sovereignty. Well, you've walked into Parliament, you've sworn your allegiance to the Crown, and you're saying your sovereignty as a First Nations person is going to be ceded? Like, you know, don't even get me started on that because I'm just heating up now. But it's interesting. What you need to know is there's a mandate for you to move forward in this. You don't have to basically, yes, listen to First Nations voices, yes, make up your own mind, but the invitation is there. What you do with that invitation is a matter for you.